Uh, our final speaker today is Dr. Nekaris, Professor of Primate Conservation at Oxford Brookes University, where she's the lead of the internationally renowned Primate Conservation Postgraduate Program. As part of 30 years of research in South and Southeast Asia, she directs the Little Fireface Project. The main base of this project is Java, Indonesia, where the team there has conducted the longest ever continuous study of a single population of nocturnal prosimian in the wild, in large part to help aid their captive care and translocation, including training forestry and wildlife staff across Asia in appropriate care and in understanding their increasingly complex taxonomy. She has also led extensive campaigns regarding the exploitation of animals on social media. In her presentation today, Dr. Nekaris will consider how translocations that do not or cannot follow the IUCN guidelines are an impediment to animal conservation and can impact individual animals' welfare. Using slow lorises as a case study, Dr. Nekaris will open up discussion on how to address this sensitive issue. It's wonderful to have you here, Anna, and please share your screen whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much. Please let me know that it works all right.
I can hear you clearly.
Okay. And let's see if this will work. Present. And then it needs to go like this. I've not used a Prezi on a Zoom before, so I'm hoping that will be all right. Can you see that okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, well, thank you so much for inviting me. And it's been really interesting to listen to the previous researchers as well, and I'll be reiterating some of the things that they've said. I would just like to acknowledge that the talk I'm giving today also has the support of a number of co-authors, including a number of researchers working on slow lorises in other range countries, including India, Bangladesh, China, and of course, Indonesia. And I think some of the things I'm going to say today might be a little bit controversial, but I hope it will open up your mind to think about the way you might do translocations in the future. So this is the Javan slow loris. It's a critically endangered primate for a number of years. It's been listed as one of the world's 25 most endangered primates. It's not because there are so few of them, but it's because there are few, but their threats are continuous and ongoing. And they represent actually the same situation as many small animals throughout the tropics face. They're small, they are nocturnal. Nocturnal species often look similar to each other. We often don't know much about their ecology. We maybe never have kept them in captivity, even in zoos. Yet they're traded heavily. And what do we do with these animals when they're traded? With the slow lorises, when I started working in Southeast Asia, which is about 22 years ago now, I was working with slender lorises in South Asia before that. And my colleagues in Southeast Asia kept saying, you have to come work with the slow lorises. We get a macaque in a rescue center. In 7 days, it's fine. In 7 days, a slow loris is dead. We don't know what's going on with these guys, and they're really difficult to care for in captivity. We saw that now recently with pangolins as well, the steps that have been undertaken to keep pangolins alive to be able to reintroduce them. And so I started this project working on Javan slow lorises in West Java, Indonesia, partially because we knew nothing about their behavior in the wild. We didn't know their home range size. We didn't know their social organization. We didn't know what they ate. And so this is the first fundamental. When you're reintroducing animals to the wild by the IUCN, you should know something about the behavior and ecology of the animal you're reintroducing. And so now we've been doing that for 12 years in West Java, making it a really interesting case to look at animals we've translocated ourselves and naturally dispersing animals as well, which I'll be talking about today. I should have started my timer. There we go. So what can we say about primates in rescue centers? This is now a decade-old study, but it was a really interesting study looking at 70 facilities that were keeping primates and housed over 6,000 individuals of over 64 species. What was interesting is in these rescue centers, Many of those animals are endangered or critically endangered. They represent about a third of the world's captive population, and many of them are not even kept by any Western zoo. So the rescue centers are the only place that some of these animals are kept. This is actually the case for the Javan slow loris. There's occasionally been one confiscated from trade in Singapore or Japan, but there's absolutely no captive breeding program for them. Why are there so many slow lorises in rescue centers? I just go through this very quickly, but they are heavily traded. They are one of the most common animals used in traditional medicines. They have over 100 uses in surveys we did in Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar. They are venomous primates. So actually, you should think this would make them less traded, but it's a problem because in order to keep them from biting their potential owners as pets, their teeth are removed, which makes it impossible to translocate them. And the pet trade is a major threat, especially where I'm working in Indonesia now. But you'll see also there are these other threats as well. So that we have the local pet trade within Indonesia. We have the international pet trade where animals are shipped to other countries, including Japan, Russia, other parts of Eastern Europe, the Middle East. They're very popular pets. They also are popular as photo props on beaches where tourists can take photographs with them. And this trade is even extended now into Europe, where you could take photographs on beaches in Turkey, for example. And they're very easy to transport because they communicate in pure ultrasound. They curl up in a ball. They're very quiet. They're hard to detect. And so they're kind of an ideal animal to smuggle. And this has led to their popularity, for example, on social media, where many more people may have seen or experienced a loris as an illegally smuggled pet than having seen one in a zoo where they're very rare or having seen one in the wild. And this has led to what we call a process of decontextualization, where it's actually normal to see an animal like this in a really unnatural setting as a pet rather than as a wild animal. And in fact, even when I'm working with popular magazines, et cetera, that want photographs of lorises, they always want them in the daylight and not at night because people like to see animals in daylight rather than nighttime. So it's an interesting case of an animal that's heavily, heavily traded, that's been appearing in rescue centers in every range country where it occurs. But there are threats I haven't even mentioned yet. But that's why they occur in the rescue centers. If we look at what's going on from maybe a popular opinion, or there's sometimes a conflict between conservationists and rescue center workers. And some argue that if you have an animal in a rescue center, you're looking at the welfare of the individual and you may not be thinking about the species as a whole. There could be a triage approach where any animal is taken in, even if it can't be released. In the case of the lorises, maybe they don't have teeth. What's going to happen? This may be based on personal judgments or emotion. And rescue centers can be criticized, as many of you might know, because their findings may be little published, or also if animals do die when they're translocated, for example, they don't want to admit that because they might be losing their funding or they might be criticized. And also, if we do these translocations that are emotional, where they're hard releases, it can be detrimental to remaining wild populations. And I'm going to give a lot of examples of that today, especially for these small nocturnal animals that likely contain many, many species. If we look at conservation, why might they be criticized, or researchers? They might be more concerned with the preservation of a species, not the individual. So there might be a criticism that individuals are dying, and this is happening at a very high rate. Well, actions are going on to help the species. Because some of these species are very rare or they're near extinct in the wild, what translocations should really be doing is restocking or reinforcing populations, not just being reintroduced for the sake of welfare or to empty cages for more animals. But what we see is a lot of these translocations that are done really well are often placed on what are called the important species, the charismatic species. Those are the ones that receive the funding. And in fact, in my few decades career now working in Asia, I have been told things like, we only keep cages for the important species. If we get a loris, we release it as quickly as possible because we don't want to waste money on that type of species. And also, interestingly, the fact that we are naming a number of new species of loris, it's considered, we don't want to even believe there are different species. We'd rather just release them. And we want to release them before you name it as a new species so we could get it out of our rescue center. Also, I would say conservationists and researchers are often criticized because there's a suggestion that they're focused on publishing results. But do they disseminate that into policy? Do they give the data back to rescue centers, to the government? And do the data they collect actually help? And finally, what conservationists might say is that reintroductions are costly and low success. And when we look at the IUCN Translocation Specialist Group, they have a great set of free publications called Back to the Wild, where people can rank their own translocation success. And in general, many are partly successful or very low success. And we do expect a very high death rate in translocations. But if we actually put those efforts into saving animals in the wild, studying them in the wild, maybe this would be a better use of money. But we do know that translocations are very popular with the public. And I will show you some examples of that in a moment as well. So today I'm going to be looking at slow loris translocations and perceptions of their success. I want to look at some scientific data and evidence for success. And I want to look at the concept of translocations as a threat, potentially, that controversial concept to slow lorises, but also other small nocturnal lookalike species, and explain why that might be the case. So if we look at some of these small and non-charismatic animals, we could think of a lot of reptiles, we could think of little brown birds, we could think of owls, we could think of civets. Many of these species don't use vision to tell each other apart. So once we look into their genetics, or we look into their vocalizations, or we look into other species mate recognition systems, we're revealing many new species all the time. And so a lot of those animals also are small, easy to handle, and they're probably not the type of animal that a lot of conservation organizations or welfare organizations focus on, because they're not so charismatic and there's little funding available for them. Because you can hold these animals in your hand, you can hard release them very easily. You might be able to take them immediately from a cage and put them somewhere in a forest. They are often released into areas with conspecifics. So when we're doing releases, we should have either a very low population density or no remaining animals in that area. They're then forced to disperse, and they may go into inappropriate areas, or they may die during dispersal. They're very often not given health checks because they're so little known. Their health parameters are unknown. And frequently as well, in hard releases, one of the IUCN guidelines of looking at the health of the wild population is also not followed. And so we can have a zoonotic disease transmission. Also, for a lot of these species, they've never been studied in the wild, so their habitat suitability isn't known. If you go to our website, we actually have a slow loris reintroduction and translocation guidelines. And here you could see this, we take this directly from the IUCN translocation guidelines. The first is to identify which species it is, to look at detailed studies of the wild animal's distribution and ecology, including its home range, social behavior, what predators it has, anything, what it eats before release, doing a population habitat viability analysis, understanding if these guys should be released, knowing the historic range of the species, knowing its habitat into a suitable site with protection, and not releasing just because there's not enough space for them in the wild. And I've already mentioned the health checks. And so you can imagine the huge number of species that are cute, small, kept as pets, used in medicines, that have never been studied in the wild, that are being released all the time, violating all of these recommendations. And I'm going to go on to some examples of how that's happening with lorises. Translocations have a feel-good factor. Here you see some press releases of an animal returned to the forest, both in the daylight, I should point out, looking really happy. And you could see the comments, "I'm praying these lorises will thrive and be safe. Fantastic news, keep up the good work. This has made my day. I'm so happy, back where they belong. But if we don't know the ecology of these animals, which we don't for most species of slow loris, we now do for Javan slow lorises, this shouldn't be done at all. If they're going to go back to the wild and not have any food to eat, if they're going to affect the ecology of other animals or other species, if they are not going to settle in the habitat and keep moving and running till they're exhausted, this initial picture of the animal being released as the feel-good factor isn't the truth of what's happening. And the public love this image. We've done a lot of studies on social media. These type of photos get more likes than any wild animal, even that animal a year later. If you follow it for a year and say, it's happy, it's just had its first baby, maybe the baby will get a like, but it's this animal in the cage going back to the forest that people want to see and want to fund. So what I'm first going to show you is taking 558 individuals that have been translocated from 170 news reports that me and my co-authors collected from just online news agencies and from social media. I'm also going to look at 2 case studies comparing a bit, 11 translocated Javan slow lorises from a rescue center, and comparing that with 11 translocated, natally dispersing, and stable wild individuals that we study in West Java, Indonesia, and give you a little bit of information about one of those individuals as well. Those data are all collected with radio tracking. And so the one translocation study went on for about 1.5 years, and we've been radio tracking lorises in West Java since 2012, and the data presented here go till 2019, but that study's ongoing. So if we look first at these newspaper articles and how they relate to those IUCN guidelines I mentioned, first we can see that we have cases in all the countries we looked at, 58 cases in Indonesia of 464 individuals. In China, we had 15 cases of 43 individuals. In Bangladesh, 25 cases of 30 individuals. And in India, 19 cases of 21 individuals. This is showing you that in China and Indonesia in particular, animals are being reintroduced as big groups. We also counted the number of people in the photographs of these animals being released. And we know already from our wild studies with slow lorises that we should always have a team of 2 or maximum 3, possibly 4 individuals. If we have 4 individuals, we have very strict procedures of how they should be following the animals because they get very, very stressed. But we had an average of 3.4 people in the photos with a maximum of 231 people appearing at a translocation. And these are more or less hard releases where the animals being released from a cage, as you see there, from in the daylight with a lot of people around. I will show you there were some in the night as well. There's an example in the night. So here we have the site should be within the historic range of the species, and few remnant wild individuals should remain. For reintroduction, there should be no remnant population to prevent disease spread, social disruption, and introduction of alien genes. What we found when we looked at the photos, 98 of these species, individuals weren't identified to species, or we could see that they were incorrect. And of the studies, only 7 species were reported, even though there were 10 species being translocated. So 3 of them were ignored altogether and not recognized as species. So that's something that's a big problem. We actually know that slow lorises have been released on to islands where they never existed. We know pygmy lorises in very large numbers have been released into Thailand, where they're not native. We know that northern and southern Sumatran lorises, which just a few weeks ago, for years, we've had morphological evidence that they were distinct species. We published a genetic study that shows they're a few million years distinct from each other, and they are being released into each other's habitats. So it's a big problem from invasive species. And we're going to see this with a lot of nocturnal animals again that look alike. Detailed studies of the biology of the species' critical needs, habitat preferences, interspecific variation, etc. If we look, 35 cases of these newspaper reports, there was no wild study ever conducted. So the habitat and the behaviors could only be inferred from other species, but we do know there are differences in how these animals behave. If we look at the post-release monitoring, none of the releases in the news articles reported post-release monitoring. There were no published studies available for any of them. And if we look as well, 70 of 116 of them were released in the daytime. And here's a study that was published where this is not from the newspaper articles, but this is an interesting case in India where animals were rescued from forest edges, from roadside plantations and home gardens. And they use the word houses, these were probably pets, and then put into a sanctuary. Well, actually, lorises really love forest edges. They love plantations, they love home gardens, and they often don't occur in the middle of forest. So those animals will run back from the forest and go back to these places. So we have these translocations from known habitats where the animals live, putting them to places where they don't live. Here's an example of being released in the day with lots of photographs being taken. And this is a really attractive species, attractive type of animal. Albinos and pet trade are really, really popular. So advertising the location of an animal like this could mean it might be captured again. And also looking at the number of individuals released, 15 individuals in a single place. I'll show you why introducing 15 or 29 individuals into one place at one time can be a problem. Here we have, they shouldn't be carried out just because captive stock exists. And here we have animals wandering into local areas, 69 of them were moved to a forest with resident populations. And so we're going to have a lot of territoriality problems. I'm going on quickly because I know this talk was originally a little bit longer and I'm trying to make it shorter. So what happens when we actually look at our translocations of these individuals that are living in the wild that we've been studying for long term, their offspring who are going to be naturally dispersing, and animals that we were able to rescue locally that we translocated into a known area. So these are animals we knew came from the local area, and we monitored those as well. Well, one thing I just want to mention about slow lorises is they're extremely territorial. So of all species where you're going to be releasing an animal into an area where there are many resident species, this could be a big problem. These are their home ranges. They live in family groups. Their home ranges have minimum overlap with neighbors. They're around 6 to 10 hectares where we're studying them. Where I worked with them in Cambodia, the home ranges were 30 hectares. And people perceive of this little slow loris as slow, often saying they live in one tree, and or they move 10 or 20 meters a night. In fact, they move a few kilometers a night, potentially, and they're moving over this very large area, so of which they're very territorial over. If we look at what the result of that territorial behavior is in males and females, they're a venomous primate, and they use their venom to fight with each other. And in the wild, this is a female, 2 different females with wounds from venomous bites. These are males with wounds from venomous bites. We find that these wounds are most common when they are dispersing. So the box you see there is the average age of dispersal for a loris, which is about 3 years. And sometimes they disperse a bit earlier, sometimes a bit later. But that dispersal age is really important. And we get all these wounds that you see here. And that red and blue plot just shows you it's essentially a figure to show how territorial they are. And it indicates they're extremely, extremely territorial. So if you have bites like these with venom and you release 15 or 29 individuals in one place at one time, it's not going to be a nice situation. If we look at their diet, they have a really specialized diet. And this has been something that's been difficult for us with zoos and rescue centers for a long time. Everywhere lorises have been studied, their main diet is gum and exudates from trees, followed by nectar. Frequently, this is not even available in a country where rescue centers exist. It's very difficult to buy in gum, and thus they're given other foods like fruits, which they almost don't touch at all in the wild. So they do eat some fruits, And we're working in an area that is full of fruit gardens, yet they still have limited intake of fruit. Again, they do eat some fruit, but it's nothing compared to gum, nectar, and insects, which are the most common items in their diet. And so what we find, here's the example of the study we did of translocations in another part of West Java. You could see nectar was a very high component of the diet. But later, when we did some habitat surveys in that area, there were virtually no exudates available. And more than 60% of the animals in that study did die. And some of them died from starving to death. So it's important that we know the diet of the animal and that food is available in the place where we translocate them. And what's interesting is a lot of gum trees are really important for nitrogen fixation of the soil. So they often occur around plantations. And that's why we frequently see lorises around plantations where those type of trees are available. If we look at, this is going to be a little bit difficult to look at, but if we look at the survival of the animals that we followed, those that were dispersing naturally and those that were dispersing because we translocated them, we were actually able to look at several factors, including how habituated they were to humans, looking at aspects of their health, looking at if they had parasites, looking if their teeth were abnormal, and if they did any strange behaviors like being too vigilant towards us, sleeping at odd times, moving to the ground. And so we found actually the higher this index was, the more likely they were going to not survive. And it's been a really great way for us to be able to predict if animals are going to survive or not. And in fact, those that were more habituated, that had been in captivity for longer, that had abnormalities of their teeth, for example, they were the ones more likely to die. And we had death in both the translocated ones and the naturally dispersing ones, because some of the naturally dispersing ones just weren't really healthy animals. So, but we did have more deaths in the translocated ones. So here we see the probability of wounds is much higher in translocated animals. Stable animals have the least wounds, followed by the dispersing wounds. So these translocated animals are fighting more. And if we look at the home range size as well, the translocated animals don't know where they're going, really. The dispersing animals are looking around, they're trying to find their home range, and they eventually settle. These images look like this. Here you see animals that are, this is two different translocated animals. The one that on my left, looking at my screen, it shows you lots of kernels where that animal was like, am I home here? Am I home here? And she couldn't find a place to settle. And she eventually died. She was gouging so much because she'd been in captivity for a while that she dislocated her jaw from over gouging. Whereas the female on the right, not only did she settle relatively quickly, she was translocated from a really busy village where she was found on a roof. She's subsequently had several offspring. So we followed her for years now, and she's a really a good example of a successful translocation. And if we look here, this is naturally dispersing individuals. The one on the left, he never could settle, and he showed really bad health. He showed very bad fur condition. He was constantly on the move, and he eventually died. Whereas the female on the right, you could see she left her natal home range, quickly settled, and we're still following that individual. So it's important to know these things, actually, to be able to also interpret what your animals are doing when you translocate them. So is there hope for these for the loris in particular? They do have an extreme diet. They have really interesting social behavior with this high territoriality, with use of venom. They do live in family groups. It's hard to convince people they're not solitary. They communicate in pure ultrasound, so people don't realize that they're actually calling to each other. And also, one thing I didn't mention, we know they use a cognitive map of their area. So they use the same routes every night, and they have a really interesting route-based system. And therefore, they need to know the area where they're being released. So this post-release dispersal, where they move very, very far and can exhaust themselves, is something we see in lots of animals. And that's why hard releases may not be the answer. But for these small, again, cheap, easy to handle, cute little species, brown species, it's quite easy to just put them out into the wild, which is, in the case for the loris, is the worst thing you could do. And what does it mean for primates? Here we can see these primates in these different facilities where many of them their behavior wasn't known in the wild. But 37% of these animals were deemed as suitable for release, mainly in Asia. And many of them, because the government likes these reintroductions, and many rescue centers are actually pressured by their local government to release animals, to release them in the case of nocturnal animals in the day for photo opportunities. And we as the scientists or the rescuers may not have a choice in that. So we may be contributing to the problem, because if we don't do it and go along with the government, they won't allow us to keep our rescue centers. So that's a question for the discussion later, is how do we deal with having to release an animal that's not known in the wild, whose species isn't known, when the government is telling us we have to do it and they're standing there watching you. This is just a table about implications of improper release. That's from a paper we wrote about 10 years ago, but it still goes on. And it's so we have to think not only of the welfare of the individual, we have to think of the welfare of the existing fauna and flora. And knowing that releasing an individual or many individuals at once could cause far more problems than keeping them in captivity. So I would just like to thank all the funders who supported my project over the last 12 years in Indonesia. And I would like to direct you to our website. We're also on social media. We do have translocation guidelines for slow lorises. Right now, they're available in English and Indonesian. But having listened to the talks today, I would really love to get them translated to other languages as well. So I think I will stop sharing my screen and see if there are any questions.
Thank you very, very much for that, Anna. That has given us lots of food for thought. The most important thing that people are asking about is all your cats in the background.
Oh, are they?
They seem to be going on little adventures everywhere. So I had a few comments about that. But you also raised the important, so many important issues. I mean, I've read into lorises and some of your work, like you said, speaking in ultrasonic communication, terrestrial. I think I read somewhere that also you've discovered they're monogamous, and there's been couples that did up for like a decade, which is absolutely incredible. And it just demonstrates how important and fundamental research is to understanding so many different critters around the world. So one of our first questions, and it's a bit of my questions and a few other people's all merged together, and you raised it just before you finished. So when I worked in Indonesia and Laos, it is common that government agents want photos with animals at the point of release or rescue. Along similar lines, either they want the media attention, or there's a lack of capacity at rescue centers. They're very quick to just push animals out with no rehabilitation or local environmental assessments. And these are issues that have been brought up by many of our members in our interviews that we've had over the last 6 months. Do you have experience, or what strategies have you used to demonstrate that this is totally inappropriate, and how can we change government policies for better results for animals?
I would say one of the countries, well, we've had really good success in Vietnam and also in Thailand, in a sense. In Vietnam, there's been some studies of lorises for quite some time. And early on, there was the following up of the translocated animals. And then we had a long-term study of pygmy lorises. And now we have EAST, which is a rescue center in the south of Vietnam. And they've been working really closely with the government, having different government guards, becoming essentially citizen scientists, checking in the different national parks where they work, where lorises are present, where they're not present, where they were present, where they've been hunted, and where they're no longer hunted. And so they've been very good at finding release sites that are over-hunted, where the animals could go back in, where through a number of training sessions and workshops, the government staff and the forest department staff were really supportive of following up and protecting those animals after they were translocated. And it was also interesting because they had a high death rate in the beginning, but they worked out if they translocated the animals at the age of dispersal, they did a lot better. So they started translocating younger animals as the priority. So I think having a good relationship with the government, including them in all of your discussions, can over time, and that's about a 10-year process. So over time, they can come around. Where we're working in Thailand, it's with Love Wildlife, where we have over 100 lorises in a rescue center there. The Thai government is really passionate that they are not released until there have been wild studies and their genetics are sorted out, because we have a really interesting part of Thailand where one species turns into another, and we don't know what's going on in the middle, if it's a different species, if it's a hybrid. We don't know exactly where that boundary is. And so there's been a lot of work to start doing. It's been a slow process, but the government themselves, though, they are waiting for all of the data to be collected before the translocations start. And one of the things that is happening now is an area set aside for soft release, where the animals could be studied in that area before they might be hard released, where they might be released and monitored later. So again, that was a number of workshops, stakeholders, inviting national scientists, national vets, international scientists, international vets working together. From my Indonesian experience, we can work with the local government. So I think it would be very hard to change the national government at the moment in Indonesia, but if you make a good relationship with the local government, when we do get the animals, occasionally, they still want the photograph of everybody walking up the mountain in the daylight with the animal, even holding the animal. And then we say, we cannot release it now. We're putting it back in the cage or in its enclosure before we release it. So we allow them the photo opportunity, but the release is still done correctly. And the trouble, like any decontextualized photograph on the internet, is that we then look at my data set of around 500 photos, say that animal was released in the daytime. So maybe in an initial press release, we would say, before its nighttime release, all of these people appeared to wish the loris on its way, or the animal on its way. So that's another option, but it's just how the use of those photos in the future could be troublesome and exacerbate those kind of releases. But it is a good solution because people do like those photographs. They do generate interest. They generate funding. We can't deny it. They generate likes on social media, which, I mean, is that a good thing or not? Who knows? But that's how we've been able to settle it as well, and working a lot with the local zoo in our area to give them training on care of lorises, improving the facilities, and providing them with gum, for example. So we're regularly providing that zoo with gum and trying to find wild sources where they could feed the lorises gum and growing the right kind of trees. But yeah, it's very, very complicated. Wow. But I would say personal relationships are really important, and don't give up if your government changes that forest staff every 6 months, which happens all over Asia. So you find that your best friends, they love your animals, they're really on board, and then they get moved somewhere else. So go straight back and start over, and don't get frustrated by that, because if that person goes somewhere else, hopefully they'll have good practice in their new place. So you're just constantly training the next person.
I think that's a really interesting point you make that is spread across all our speakers, is the development of relationships at a local or ground level. That's where results happen. Changing national policy overnight is fairly impossible. Another tricky question we've got is, given that SARCs are overflowing with animals and government pressures to take animals in and limited resources, agents forcing releases to happen, is there a middle ground to releasing wildlife, or a bare minimum set of tasks that should be met to give the animals the best chance? Or is it a complete no, essentially?
That's why I say, is it a threat or not? Because if we know that, many of these, we could take Australia, for example, or North America, where we have really, really well-funded releases that every single animal is monitored. And we see that there's often a 10 or 20% survival rate in those releases. And that's with all the money, all the resources. So we actually know that when we do monitor, we don't have an amazing survival rate. So that's difficult point number one. So is it better to preserve that already existing wild population? Why put more pressure on them? They already have very limited habitat. I think getting creative with releases is one example, working with eco hotels, eco lodges, golf courses, where some of these, not leopards, of course, but a lot of our small species, different birds, civets, etc., they could thrive in those places. And so I think a lot of private land is a good option for potential releases that's underutilized at the moment. We're working with a really big energy company at the moment that has private land. We're working with some plantations that have private land, and those owners, at least for their lifetime, are going to potentially be passionate about animal conservation in that area. And hopefully by the time they've had that land, the population will be established. So private land is one option where I think the worst is national parks as dumping grounds. And fighting against that it's the one place where we're going to have good wild populations, and to keep putting pressure on them by putting animals into those places. Or we have cases in Indonesia where we have these small islands that animals that aren't native to those islands are released onto those islands. We really, that's, I think, is wholly inappropriate, and we shouldn't be releasing animals outside their native range. And we just have to, in that case, I mean, I don't want to kill any animal. I'm vegan, but euthanasia sometimes is better. I say if I was put naked into a rainforest and left to starve to death, I would rather be euthanized first, in a sense, because it may feel like we're doing something good for the animal, but if it's terrified, not in the right habitat, it's going to be really cold, really hot, have no food. That's a really terrible way to go. I don't think it's really giving it a chance. So again, if we don't know about the species, also just getting to know about the species, even in the rescue center, I know all the time being limited, but trying to find out something about these species we know nothing about, like recording it, sharing it somehow.
Yeah, that's another point that's been raised to us quite a lot, is the lack of research that may be out there, because it can be quite difficult to publish studies where your N number or your sample is relatively small. So finding other ways in which we can share and disseminate information on when release of one or two individuals may have been successful with some ongoing study is also something we need to, it's something we need to talk about and find out how we can better share that. One last question we have for you before we take a bit of a break is, what would you say are the main challenges in understanding the ecology of most loris species? Is it lack of capacity, funding, or difficulty studying these species because of their nocturnal lifestyle?
I would say it's lack of species champions. So you need someone who's really passionate about that species in each country where it occurs to actually undertake a long-term study. A lot of young people these days, they want to spend 1 year on something and then move on to something else, or 6 months or 3 months. So the younger people are the shorter time. They're like, and now I'm going to go work on this project, or now I'm going to go work on this species. But for an animal with a long life, any of the primates, any of the carnivores, you need a 5 or 10 or 20 year study to really understand their behavior. And to commit that is something that a lot of people find difficult. And having people who are willing to be the champion of that species and dedicate that time is difficult. And also, I would just say, anyone who's listening, you can be a world expert in so many species, but everyone goes for the same ones. I'm going to work on orangutans. I'm going to work on chimpanzees. I'm going to work on elephants. And just pick a hyrax instead of an elephant. Pick a langur instead of an orangutan. There's so much to learn. And having run a master's course in primate conservation with 450 students over 20 years, it's still 70% apes and macaques people want to study. So and there's 630 or so species of primates, so that's primates, which are really charismatic, and still people want to study the same few species. So just being more open as researchers and loving more animals is really important.
And I think you're an ode to picking something that's a little bit unusual and making an amazing career out of it, and learning so much and contributing to the conservation of these species. Thank you very much for your talk and presentation today. We're going to take another quick 10-minute break so we can all make another cup of tea, and we'll be back at the